Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience and for joining us this afternoon, for an update on drought conditions in the Southeast region. Today's webinar is the second in a series that is addressing the 2019 Southeast drought. Now, at the time of our first webinar in early October, hold on one second. Apologies, I'm having a hard time. There we go. In our first webinar a few weeks ago, about 1 month ago, many parts of the Southeast region were experiencing record heat and weeks without rain. The impacts of the fast emerging drought, oftentimes called flash drought, were already being felt in a number of areas, in particular on the agriculture sector. Now, since early October, much of the region has experienced precipitation, bringing some drought relief, as indicated in the drought monitor map released today and shown on the screen, where darker colors represent increasing levels of drought severity. You could see the change in 1 month. So some of the key questions that is being asked in the region: is the drought over, and what can we expect in the near future? Today's webinar will cover the following. We'll provide an overview of current conditions of drought in the region. We will also then focus a bit on the hydrological components, for example, Streamflow and Reservoirs. And then we'll do a quick impact update on the agriculture sector and wrap it up with an outlook on drought and what to expect in the near future. And at the end, we will also provide some key resources for additional information at state and regional levels, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. Now, as we go through this webinar, please feel free to list any of your questions in the chat box, and we will address them at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online as well. Now, my name is Meredith Muth, and I'm a Regional Drought Information Coordinator for NIDIS, which is the National Integrated Drought Information System. NIDIS, through a mandate from the U.S. Congress, has a mission to improve the nation's capacity to proactively manage drought-related risks. Now, a key component of NIDIS is to make drought information available through partnerships between federal, state, tribal, academic, and local experts. And it is in the spirit that NIDIS is hosting this webinar today to share broadly the most current information on drought and drought impacts in the Southeast. In fact, much of the information was just released today. And we are fortunate to have with us 4 excellent speakers that are well-recognized experts on drought in the Southeast region. Let me introduce our first one, Chip Conrad, Director of the Southeast Regional Climate Center, also a member of the NOAA RESA team. And Chip will provide us with an overview of where we are now in the current conditions. Chip, it's all yours.
Okay, well, it's great to be able to give an update on this drought. And so what I really want to talk about here first is the changes that we've seen over the last month. We all know that precipitation, fortunately has really returned to the region. But there are, however, some areas that haven't gotten quite as much precipitation. So we do have some lingering drought. We'll talk about that. Also say a little bit about the replenishment of at least the upper level soil moisture. And we've seen some rise in stream levels, and we've had major reductions in drought intensity. Next slide. Okay, so we had our last call just about exactly a month ago, and really it was a couple of days after that, October 12th to 13th, that really marked the apex of the 2019 flash drought. And so that was reflected in the drought monitor that came out on October, or at least for October 15th. And so really from that point onwards, we've really seen a whole lot of precipitation. Next slide. And so this is reflected here in the statistics that were just reached from the National Center for Environmental Information, just released yesterday. And this shows statewide precipitation ranks for the month of October. And here we're talking about, September being record dry in a lot of places. Well, October was quite wet. And if you look at the map here, you can see, in fact, it was the record wettest there in Mississippi. And Alabama was shortly behind it. And of course, parts of Alabama were suffering from extreme drought, but really the entire region saw above normal precipitation. So it was a huge shift in the second half of October. Next slide. And so this shift is reflected in a big change or shift really in the large scale circulation. And this map here basically shows departures from what we normally see in circulation. And I just really want to point out two key features. There's the big red area that you see there in the Northeast Pacific, just south of Alaska. That represents a very big ridge of upper level circulation. And so the jet stream is going way up into Alaska and then diving down around that area of blue and purple. And so we had what's called a very deep trough situated in the interior western US, all the way over to the high plains area. And so this pattern here is connected with a lot of really warm, unseasonably warm water that's in the Northeast Pacific. There are also a couple of typhoons, interestingly, that came up in that area, basically pushed a lot of tropical warmth up in that area, really built up that ridge. And as that ridge got stronger, the trough got a lot deeper in the interior part of the country. And so anyway, that had a big effect in terms of us, in terms of getting a lot of precipitation. You see the little arrow down there at the bottom along the Gulf Coast there. So that basically allowed some tropical systems to get pushed up into our area and provide quite a bit of rainfall. Next slide. And so the first tropical system was Nestor that formed down in the Gulf of Mexico and moved quite rapidly to the northeast and very rapidly became an extra tropical system. So fortunately, it moved along pretty quickly, so there wasn't serious flooding, but it did provide a good dose of precipitation. And you can see there all those yellow areas receiving more than 1.5 inches. And this is just over 24-hour time period back on October 20th. Next slide. And so then just less than a week later, then we had Tropical Storm Olga, who developed down off the coast of Texas, southeast Texas. Very similar, moved to the northeast quickly, and then very quickly basically merged in with the complex mid-latitude system. And this system really, it had some training of heavy rain cells. And so there were some local areas that got well over 6 inches of rain. And so you can see there in western parts of Alabama, Tuscaloosa in particular, received over 6 inches of rain in a 24-hour time period. So lots and lots of rain there. But one thing I really want to point out is there's not much distance separating the areas that got the heavy rain from areas that got very little rain at all. And so while this system, dumped a lot of rain in the western parts of the area affected by drought, there are areas in southeast Alabama and much of Georgia that didn't get much rain at all from this system. Next slide. And so we take a look then at just the amount of precipitation that we've gotten over the last month. This comes from the High Plains Regional Climate Center. And so all of the sort of the purple that you see there are areas that received more than 1.5 times what they would get over this 30-day period. And so this has yielded a big improvement in the drought conditions. However, I want to point out that there's some sort of local areas there that saw much less rain. Next. And so I've got a few of these highlighted here, and I think the most marked one there is that sort of hole in precipitation in parts of North Georgia. So this is the Atlanta area going over to Athens, and then over just north of Augusta, and then swinging over to Columbia, South Carolina. So unfortunately, this is an area that was that's quite affected by this flash drought. And so they basically saw precipitation that was very close to normal levels, in some cases even a little bit below normal. Another little pocket there in south central Alabama, and also extreme southern Georgia and parts of northern Florida. Next slide. Okay, and so Meredith, you could just toggle back and forth a little bit. I thought this would be very useful just to show, how much of a decrease that we've seen here in the drought over the last month. And so this rainfall, as you can see, has been very, very beneficial. And so we'll take it to the most current drought monitor there for the next day. If you could just move that the other direction. And what would basically the drought monitor released today. And so we see that many areas have shown a 1 to 2 category improvement over the last 4 weeks. Fortunately, all of the extreme drought has been removed from Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, and all of the severe drought has been removed from Virginia and North Carolina. This is all really good news. However, it is not over. And we know, in the wintertime that droughts tend to go into a senescent state, that, in terms of water balance, we don't get nearly as much evaporation. we tend to get rainfall too that doesn't come all at once, and so we get a lot more soaking rains. So we're going into the time of the year, in which droughts typically improve, but we still have some significant drought in these areas and these pockets, and so these are areas that we're going to have to watch out for. Next slide. And so basically, this just shows the improvement over time. And I think the one thing I just want to highlight there is that area of no change. So you see all those gray areas there over much of South Carolina and bits of Georgia and North Florida and bits of maybe the southeastern part of Alabama. There really hasn't been much change. Now, one little thing here, caveat I must mention, this is from basically October 8th to November 5th. Well, between October 8th and October 15th, there was some worsening of the drought. So the bottom line here basically is that these areas really haven't seen much improvement. So indeed, we've taken an edge off the worst aspects of the drought, but it's still very much there in these areas. Next slide. Okay, and this is my last slide here, but I just put this up here. This shows the percent of normal precipitation. The first map panel there on the left shows April 1 basically to present, and the second one shows July 1 to present. And I want to point out all those areas of orange, and you see some areas there that tend to be red, and so all those are areas that have gotten 90% or less precipitation, and in a few cases less than 70% of the precipitation. And so when we look at rainfall over long time periods, this really relates a lot to emergence of hydrologic drought or long-term drought. And so this is pointing out that we have significant precipitation deficits, and we're really going to have to hope, during the winter that we get some replenishment here, that we have some months of above normal precipitation to start to fill in for this. And if we get less than normal precipitation, of course, we could be in some trouble as we get into spring. Next slide.
Great, thank you so much, Chip. We will now draw our attention to hydrological drought, as you mentioned, and some key aspects related to the hydrology in the Southeast. And we are joined today by Todd Hamill and Jeff Dober from the National Weather Service Southeast River Forecast Center.
And this is Todd, and Jeff is sitting beside me. He's done a lot of the research on some of this, but I've been talking about it all day, doing different things. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of this stuff. So I think I can go. Nope, I can't go to the next slide. So you're probably going to have to go ahead and advance these.
I just gave you control.
Okay, thank you. There we go. So, there we go. Hold on. It got a little ahead of me. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the first one, and we're talking about the stream flows. So, fortunately, where that rainfall fell, as Chip was talking about, a lot of it was at the headwaters of many of these rivers across the Southeast. So, we talk about where our rivers and our stream flows have improved across the Southeast, and we start in the western portion in Mississippi and Alabama, where we've had probably the most significant rain. And in those areas, we're in the top, the 90 percentile for a lot of those. And then as you go across the northern tier and along the Appalachians, you can see many of the rivers in those areas are in the, in above normal or near normal in almost all of those areas. And I'll talk in a little bit about how that's affected the reservoirs, but just overall, we've seen a great deal of improvement over most of the Southeast and over most of the rivers for two reasons. One, the rain has fallen at the tops of those basins, so the water has moved through those systems and has kept those rivers near normal or above normal in some cases. And then where we had some of the lesser rainfall from a river standpoint, we do see some, like in central Georgia, in the Suwannee Basin in South Georgia and northern Florida, we do see some of the drought areas that don't have rivers that are coming all the way from the north. So that's where we're seeing probably the most impact from not having rainfall in those areas. But one thing I want to show you, as we look at the graphic on the right, you can see at the top here, we've had a record-setting year. At the very beginning of January, end of December, and the beginning of January, we had record high flows This is the 28-day average of stream flows across the sun. It's runoff, but it correlates to stream flows across the southeast. But we had the highest in January. And if you look between January and September and early October, we went to the lowest. So in just a 9-month period, we had some of our highest flows in the southeast and went then to our lowest flows in the southeast, and very unusual. And you can see how quickly that that changed in September. We had been normal for most of the year. Once we had that high part, and once we got to March, we were very much in normal, kind of fluctuating in there. But how quickly we went in that August through September timeframe and into October, and how quickly we got dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of the states. We've looked at the whole southeast, and so now we're going to look at the states. And you can see this is Alabama. And again, it has a very similar, it was very close to its record at the beginning of the year, and then it has dropped, but it has recovered very quickly. Now remember that this is looking at the whole state. It's not, and so it's possible it's the western part of the state is influencing that eastern part. So even though we still have some drought areas in the eastern part, the western part has gotten a lot of good rainfall and stream flow. So we are increasing there, and as an overall in the state, our 28-day average runoff and stream flows in the state is above normal right now. When we get to Georgia, again, the same thing, where we see record highs and then down to record lows in Georgia. But it has recovered, and you see it doesn't take too much. We did see some good rainfalls, and overall, we're seeing that stream flow recover in Georgia and seeing improvements there. So we move up to South Carolina, and the South Carolina, again, we see exactly the same pattern. We did have record highs. We did not get quite as low as far as record lows in South Carolina, but we are seeing improvement there. But we're as Chip showed, there's a swath of dryness through South Carolina, from the Greenville area and Columbia, and all the way across that central part. And so they're not recovering quite as fast. And so obviously they are going to need some rainfall to see improvements. And we'll talk about what that might take when we get near the end. So North Carolina, again, they were very high during that January time frame, and they didn't get quite so low also, and have seen improvements. And a lot of that area, the western third of North Carolina has been much above normal these last 3 or 4 weeks. So that's been good for them. And we still, because we were so dry before that, we have not seen that much flooding, which is great news. The rain has been enough to help replenish things, but not enough to cause flooding, which is obviously very good news. And the last one I'll show you is Florida. Now, Florida is kind of odd, only because we do include the whole state of Florida, and sometimes we split them up. We split them up into different parts because the climatology in Florida is a little bit different. In the Panhandle and stuff, it acts much more like the Southeast and Alabama and Georgia. And then when you get further to the peninsula of Florida and further south, it tends to be we're going into a dry season there. And so they've had enough rain in the central part of Georgia that this is pretty normal right now. Their stream flows are above normal. But as you get it more into the Panhandle, we've got some areas that aren't recovering quite so much, and we showed where those were in South Georgia and northern Florida. So we don't see quite the recovery in Florida that we would think. Like I said, it's kind of a tale of two parts of Florida. But we are seeing improvements, and we have seen some rain in those areas. So now that we've looked at the stream flows, one of the effects and one of the things that we see from that is the reservoirs. And so we'll look to the reservoirs to see where they are compared to where they should be for this time of year. And so we start up in Virginia, and Philpott and Kerr, they are both 2 feet and 3 feet above normal. This is along the Roanoke Basin up in Virginia, and those are both showing above normal pools in those areas. And so you start, that's the Roanoke Basin. And we start getting into central Georgia or central North Carolina, and as we look at those, they're very close to normal. They're slightly below normal, but very close to normal for this time of year. And they're a little further away from the mountains, so they don't see quite as much of that rainfall that we've seen in that western third of the state. But again, they've had enough rainfall that they're very close to normal for this time of year. We start to look at rivers that are flowing south into South Carolina, and that it's High Rock and Cowan's Ford and some of these other ones, and they are either near normal or above normal. And again, it's because of the rainfall that's been further to the west, along the Appalachians and everything else, and that's kept things fairly at least normal to above normal in those areas. And then you creep down into South Carolina, and some of these are, again, very close to normal. And even though we've had dryness through those areas, we have had some rain up in the top parts of those basins. And that's part of the reason that I mentioned that, is that even though we're dry with respect to maybe agriculture and everything else, our stream flows are in decent shape because of the water that's moved through them from upland and from the Appalachians. So we're in pretty good shape through most of South Carolina until we get to the Savannah Basin. And you can see that Hartwell and Thurmond, those are the ones with all the storage in them, and they are a little bit below normal. And they're probably the most, the ones that will have the best chance of staying in drought or getting a little bit worse as we go through the winter. They do lower their pools to handle extra rainfall in our recharge season, which will be starting up in the next month. But they're still falling a little bit below normal, and is one area that we're going to have to watch very closely. So North Georgia, here we have Lake Lanier, and this is always one. This was on Meredith's first slide that we were showing, and for this time of year, they have a summer pool of 1071, and then they go down to a winter pool so they can hold a little bit more water as we get into those winter rains. And they're in that transition period, and so they should be at 1070.4, and they're almost 3 feet below normal for this time of year. They do want to get down to 1070 by the beginning of December, so they're going down just a little bit more, but all these rains will end up helping them, and they may end up meeting up back to normal here fairly soon. Allatoona and Carter's, these are dams that hold water that run into Alabama, and they're a little bit below normal. And both of these are also shifting down to their winter pool to hold water, to hold floodwaters, potential floodwaters during the winter. And then as we look into central Georgia and some of the ones below Athens and all that, they're a little bit below normal or very close to normal. So we're in good shape in most of these through central Georgia, and then as we start to get to South Georgia, there's not a whole lot of storage in these. They don't hold a whole lot of water, and they can't hold a whole lot of water, but they're very close to normal too, which we usually expect this time of year. And they typically do not fluctuate all that much. We get into northern Alabama, and obviously we've had all that rain. We talk about the rain in North Georgia and the mountains and so forth. And so for the most part, all of the reservoirs in Alabama are in very good shape right now. And again, these are in the northern part of Alabama where we've seen the rainfall. And then we go a little further west and go to the Black Warrior Basin and those areas. And again, we're in good shape as we go into the winter as far as the drought goes with respect to stream flows and the reservoirs and their target pools. And so our stream flow forecast from December through February, and I'll do this forecast, and I know that Chip's probably going to talk about this in a little bit, but right now it looks like we're going to be in a neutral ENSO condition, so no La Nina, no El Nino. It looks like we'll be slightly warmer than normal out in the Pacific, so that kind of affects this forecast. So I mentioned that, like I said, Chip may mention that in just a little while, but it looks like for the most part, we're going to have near normal stream flow through the southeast. And I'll show a graphic right after this that kind of talks a little bit about that. But our chances for precipitation are equal between above normal, near normal, and below normal as for the Climate Prediction Center. And our recent trends of wetter and these fronts coming through have made a big difference. And as we look forward, it looks like that trend will continue, even though it looks like we're going to be a little bit dry and cold for a good part of November, at least in the next week or so, week and a half. that does help things that we're not getting evaporation and nearly as much evaporation out of the soils and improvement. And one of the last thing with this graphic I'll say is that history kind of hints, you know, we looked at years where we've been dry in the fall in that September, October timeframe, and then we looked at those that were neutral years. And what we found was that we had 6 of those years associated with a neutral forecast. And so what we found was that in 5 of those 6 years, we ended up being above normal. We ended up being in good shape once we got to February, and most things were near normal or above normal. We had 1 year that ended up being below normal. So we're looking that as we get through the season, through the rest of this winter season, that we should be in good shape going into February. And the 2 areas that we'll be most concerned about that's going to take a little bit more is the Savannah watershed and the Suwannee watershed in South Georgia and North Florida. And the last one I'll show is kind of we looked back to the past to kind of find something that looked similar. And if you look back to 1993 and 94, that 94 time frame, again, we had a very similar thing where we were at high levels early in the year. And here we go. This was in January of 93. And as we come down, you see that we get into October, November, and we were very dry at that time. And during that, it was a neutral year, and we ended up being in that normal range as we went through the rest of February. Now, again, that's just 1 year. It's one comparison. We can't, but this is 2019, and it looks very similar. So it's possible that that might be to correlate one to the other, but again, it's just 1 year. And but we did notice through neutral years that we tend to be, at least in 5 of the 6 years that we looked at neutral years over the last 30, or 40. We did find that by February, 5 of these 6 years, we were back into normal and good shape. So that is mine. So if you want to take control, then I'll go one more, and you can go ahead and go to Pam.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff and Todd. And now we'll have Pam Knox from the University of Georgia. Pam also presented during our last webinar and gave a detailed description on impacts of agriculture. We asked her to come back today to give essentially an update on where we are. Pam, all yours.
Thank you. You might remember we spent quite a bit of time talking about agricultural impacts last time because flash droughts typically affect agriculture first because they're so intense. The rain that we have seen over the last month has provided some relief to some farmers, but not all of them. And so I'm going to just give a little bit of an update. So Meredith, you go to the first slide. We'll talk a little bit about the impacts on corn and cotton. I'm not seeing it yet. See, Meredith, did we get it?
I know. I know. Pam, have you tried on your end?
I have not, but I can. Oh, there. Now I see corn and cotton. Well, one of us did it anyway. So a lot of the corn, if it was irrigated corn, was doing fine. Dryland corn was not doing so well. But some farmers actually plant two different rounds of corn. So they have the first crop early in the year, they harvest it, and then they plant another crop after that. The second crop corn for those farmers was actually doing better because of more rain, but it's pretty high moisture, which means they're probably going to have to dry it. And of course, there'll be costs associated with running their dryers for that. For harvests around the Southeast, cotton, soybean, peanuts, and sweet potato were all hampered by the rain. You know, it was really dry, and some people, especially the peanut farmers, were having a lot of trouble getting the peanuts out of the ground. But in this case, some areas got over 5 inches in a day, and you cannot run your harvesting equipment when you have that much mud. And so we went from being too dry to harvest to being, in some cases at least, too wet to harvest. And I know some of the cotton farmers were complaining because the wet conditions was not really good for the cotton. The quality was going down, and so that was a little bit of a concern. And many farmers have noted that because of the drought earlier this year, the yields on the harvest that they've completed have gone down quite a bit. It's a little too early to say exactly how much, but some places have lost quite a bit. Other places maybe it's gone down 10 or 20%. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. On the next slide, we talk about peanuts. Can you do that one? Oh, there we go. Oh, can you go back to peanuts? There we go. If you've got irrigated peanuts, the harvest has been ahead of schedule. In fact, most of the crops have been ahead of schedule, although the rain did slow that down just a little bit, but we're still ahead of schedule for the year. Dryland peanut producers were finally able to catch up with the moisture. It was a little easier to dig the peanuts out of the ground, but they were having some yield problems as well. And a couple of the producers noted that with that rain on the vines, that made it hard to invert the peanuts out of the ground. The peanuts were coming off the vines and staying in the ground, so that also reduces yields. And so that was a problem that they noted with the rain. That was something that obviously they hadn't had a problem with earlier with the dry conditions. The next slide talks about vegetables. Some of the comments about vegetables have been that there's a lot of, with the rain, the humidity is higher. So they're seeing a lot more disease pressure on the vegetables, especially in the morning, and that's because that's when the humidity is usually the highest. And that means that quality has gone down somewhat, and they're having to throw away some of their vegetable crops. And generally, things are proceeding pretty well. A lot of vegetables are irrigated, and so summer crops are basically nearing completion, and they're starting to put in winter crops now that they've got soil moisture enough to do germination of the crops or to get the crops established. We're kind of approaching the end of the growing season. I know here in Georgia, we've already had some frost up in the northern part of the state, and I think this weekend we're going to see a much wider scattering of that. So we're getting towards the end of the summer growing season. There's still some plants like cabbages that can survive some of the cooler temperatures, but that's something that's going to be transitioning over the next couple weeks. And one of our key crops in Georgia is Vidalia onions, which are usually planted in the fall. They're a little concerned about how dry the conditions are. It's very sandy soil for onions. And they have had some moisture, but still would like to see a little bit more to get those onions planted. The next slide talks about hay and forage. Farmers have noted that some of the pastures now are starting to green up a little bit, but they're not going to grow long enough to actually get a cutting of hay because the frost is going to come and kill off those summer pastures. But they are able to go in now and plant some of the winter annual forages. Those are starting to come up, so the moisture has been really good with that. But producers have noted that they probably are going to be really short of hay this year, so they're going to have to continue to feed hay from their winter supplies. They're probably going to have to buy hay to get through the winter. So they're continuing to cull the cattle, get rid of the cattle they don't want to keep. And a few of the areas that are producing cattle really haven't seen much drought relief. In fact, if you looked at some of the drought maps, you can actually see there's a couple areas that have gotten worse over the last month, including South Central and Southwest Georgia and parts of North Central Florida. So those areas really did not see much relief, and they're continuing to have problems with forage. We go to the next picture, or next slide. As I mentioned, some areas really have not received enough rainfall to have their water supplies refill. And so they're worrying about how to keep the animals well watered as well as fed. And water supplies in other areas are increasing. It's a little deceptive when you get 5 inches in a day because a lot of that doesn't really get into the soil. It just runs right off. And so it might be good for the reservoirs, but it doesn't do a lot for the soil moisture. So that's something we kind of have to keep in mind. And then my last slide is a summary slide. The rain that we've seen over the last month has hampered harvest of many crops, also reduced yields to some extent, but it has improved conditions for fall planting for sure, and it has also helped keep the harvest going ahead of the normal. We don't really know what kind of latent problems we're going to see next year. That could include things like pecan and peach trees. If they're not kept irrigated during the dry conditions, that's going to reduce yields next year. It's just really too early to tell that yet. And then one final comment, which I think is probably more editorial than anything else, that I think that drought monitors really still is not adequately capturing the drought in some of those places that got missed by the rain, especially southwest Georgia. I think there's a tendency once you get some rain, as everybody starts kind of relaxing and says, oh, well, things are going to improve. But you have to, when you've got the spotty rain where you've got tropical storms coming in and out, some areas get hit, others get missed. Those small differences can really be a big problem for farmers that get missed continually. So that's all I've got.
Thank you for that update, Pam. And we will wrap it up in terms of an outlook looking forward, going back to Chip.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. Just kind of highlighting some things that have already been brought out here. So we know that the heavy rain has doused much of the short-term drought, but there's still impacts, as Pam's pointing out, that are ongoing. I mentioned too that, droughts tend to go into hibernation in late fall and winter. And if there's not sufficient recharge in the winter, they can reemerge in the spring. And so that's something we have to think about, in terms of looking at the forecast in the coming months. As I emphasized earlier, there's still some areas that have major precipitation deficits. And so if conditions are drier than normal in the coming months, those are areas where hydrologic drought may emerge as we go into the spring months. Next. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through looking for the remainder of November and then through the winter and the spring. And so if we look here, just starting basically, this is from the Climate Prediction Center. This is sort of the predicted pattern that we're going to see and during the second week. So this is basically November 14th to 20th. And what it really shows is an amplification of the pattern that we're going into now. It's amplified in the fact that we've got a big ridge out west. Of course, we've had it there, but that ridge is going to be slightly further east, which means the trough is really going to be centered in the Great Lakes and down into the southeast region. And so, of course, that means much colder conditions. Next slide. And so if we look at their forecast here in the week 2 period, starting off with precipitation, the interior southeast basically has equal chances of seeing below or above normal precipitation. But you see there that light green area there, sort of interior to the coast, all the way from the Virginia Tidewater down to Florida and western panhandle of Florida in that area. And so there's a bit more of a chance, a 33% chance or greater, that they'll see above normal precipitation, an even greater chance, of course, as you go down into central and southern Florida. And with this really amplified pattern, there's some chance that we're going to see a low pressure system develop along a front down the Gulf of Mexico and move basically along the Gulf Coast. And that would be really helpful. That could potentially drop an inch or a couple of inches of rain in some of those coastal areas and basically the panhandle areas of Florida and extreme South Georgia that are still seeing a big precipitation deficit. I put temperature up here because this relates to agriculture, as Pam was pointing out. There's very high confidence that we're going to see major cold air outbreak. And so some areas are going to see temperatures much below normal. And so certainly this is something that can affect agriculture, obviously. So agriculture is already impacted by drought in terms of delayed harvest and so forth. So just another sort of a secondary factor to look at. Next slide. Okay, and so this is the forecast for the latter half of November, so November 16th to 29th, precipitation forecast. And so really the entire southeast is in this equal chances of getting above and below normal precipitation. Something that Todd pointed out is that we have ENSO normal conditions in the equatorial Pacific right now. And what that means, certainly in the deep south, is that our ability to predict precipitation through the season is not as great as it would be if we were in a La Nina or sort of in the El Nino phase. Next slide. And so if we stretch this out and we look at the winter forecast, December going all the way through February, again, this is from the Climate Prediction Center, really about the entire area has equal chances of getting above or below normal precipitation. So there really is some uncertainty here. In the longer time frame, which is pretty common when we go this far out in advance. Next slide. And so pretty much ditto, very similar pattern as we look towards the spring, equal chances of above or below normal precipitation. Next slide. Okay, so just a quick summary in terms of what we're expecting in the future. So across the interior Southeast, we have, at least here in the short run, equal chances of above or below normal precipitation, but there is some chance of getting some precip along the coast in the week, especially going into the week 2 period, and even more of a chance as we get down into central and southern Florida. But really, when we're talking about it in terms of hydrologic drought, we're looking at precipitation over much longer time periods. And right now, there's equal chances of above or below normal precipitation. So we're going to have to really wait and see this winter to see what sort of pattern emerges. And I think we'll really begin to see some signs of that as we get into the latter part of November and into December. Okay, that's all my slides, Meredith.
Great. Thank you so much, Chip, Pam, Jeff, Todd told excellent story, so to speak, of laying out what has happened in the past month, of where we are now, and a look at what might be coming up next. Right now, I just want to put on the slides. I'm not going to talk through it. These slides will be available and posted online, of where those of you who are interested in finding additional information, in particular at the state level as well as the regional level related to climate and drought, where you can find this information. We have it for Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida. State climatologists in particular, an excellent resource, and each state has a slightly different process of monitoring drought and drought plans and policies. So for more information, please visit those sites. There's also some excellent regional drought resources in the Southeast, and I've listed a few here, including a few from where our speakers are from: the Southeast Regional Climate Center, National Weather Service. I want to do a shout out to Pam's Southeast Climate and Agriculture blog. It's excellent. The USDA Southeast Climate Hub, and also the U.S. Drought Monitor, which you saw several maps today, and the U.S. Drought Portal, which is the Keenitis website, and you can sign up for a biweekly Dry Times newsletter. In addition, in the Southeast, there is specific to the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin. There are regular drought webinars every month. We encourage you to join those if you're interested, and the information is here. Next one is Tuesday, November 12th. We also wanted to link to, since the Drought Monitor is mentioned several times, there is a new online tutorial that was jointly created by USDA, National Drought Mitigation Center, and NIDIS. It's an excellent resource. And USDA and the National Drought Mitigation Center also recently released a new fact sheet. It's a 2-page document, really easy to understand, summarizing drought-related programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And there is the link. Again, if anyone has any questions, please list those in the box, and our presenters will answer that. We will send out after the webinar a link to the recording. If you would like slides, please email me directly. And if you would be so kind as to stay on for an extra minute after the webinar and let us know how we did and what we could do better, please take the post-webinar survey. And so let's go ahead and start with any questions. Actually, I don't see any questions, so I will let it go for another minute. I do see a comment related to upper Flint flows have not recovered, and then several questions on if the recording is available.
This is Todd from the Southeast River Forecast Center, and the Flint has recovered a little. A lot of the heavier rains have been just north of that basin. It really, as Chip showed, it kind of, as we went through central Georgia and all that, we haven't quite seen them improvement just because of where those heavy rains have been. And they haven't been at the top of the basin. And in the middle of the basin, we've had a little bit more rain. So that's at least part of the reason that the Flint River, we had, as those hurricanes started to approach the area, we really did think that they were going to, that the Flint River Basin would get more rain, but it ended up being a little further north and west, and so the Chattahoochee got a lot of that, but Flint did not get the recovery quite as much, and so it's close to normal. It won't take as much, I think, to get it back to normal, I think normal rains will take care of that. And that's kind of what we're looking at for this winter. So again, we'll be watching that real closely. But you're right, it has not quite recovered quite as much as some of other areas in the southeast.
Thank you for that clarification. I'll keep it open for another couple minutes if there's any other questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else. So anyways, I'd like to thank once again our excellent presenters and everyone for joining us today. And please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.